The views expressed on this podcast are those of the participants, not of Reuters News.
Increasing competition from abroad, high energy costs, elevated interest rates, and uncertain economic prospects have taken a toll on Germany. The economy contracted in 2024 for the second year in a row.
But when it comes to defense spending, even 2% of GDP is not enough. 3 and 4, and ultimately, as President Trump has said, 5% of defense spending is critical. A realization that there is a Russian war machine that has sought to take more and more land in Ukraine. And standing up against that is an important European responsibility. And of course, the United States has been there for a long time.
Germans are going to the polls this Sunday at a critical moment for Europe. We're recording this on Tuesday, just days after the US Defense Secretary has said it's no longer primarily focused on European security. President Donald Trump is threatening reciprocal tariffs, and the US and Russia have begun discussions about the future of Ukraine, raising big questions about the shape of any peace deal and the role Europe will play in policing it. This and more is the focus of this week's Viewsroom. Welcome back to the Viewsroom, the weekly podcast that invites you, the listener, into a lively debate with Breakingviews columnists about the biggest stories of the week. And I'm your host, Amy Donlan.
And I'm Jonathan Guilford. Amy, obviously we're at a pretty febrile moment for US-European relationships, for the relationship between Europe and other global great powers, given what's happening in Ukraine. And in Germany as well, it feels like, to an outside observer, it's been a pretty back and forth, kind of confused few years since we saw the exit of Angela Merkel as Chancellor, now leading through to what is a pretty interesting, I don't know if you would call it an influence campaign by the likes of Elon Musk in the US to kind of support the AfD. I mean, it feels all pretty crazy and difficult to predict from the US side. Do things feel any more stable down on the ground over there in Europe?
No, I would say briefly, they certainly do not. I think it's amazing as well how quickly this story is evolving. And how European leaders have had to really kind of scramble to kind of come up with a sort of response to what's coming from the US, which has been sort of like a big brother, protecting Europe from all sorts of adversaries, that has now changed. And they are kind of on their own in the way that sometimes you are when you grow up, you realize you're on your own, and Europe is very much realizing that at the moment. And I think these German elections are very interesting because you mentioned obviously the AfD. Which is the sort of right-wing party. And we've seen this in many Western elections over the past year, where there has been an option of a more extreme, I would say more anti-immigration party that has tended to do well, and they certainly seem like they're getting support. So we're very lucky to have Pierre Briançon, who's been following this story very closely, as well as the situation in Ukraine, and George Hay, who is the head of EMEA for Breakingviews. So Pierre, George, you are very welcome.
Good to be here.
Hi there.
So, Pierre, if we could start, because I mean, the reason we are talking here, I mean, there's obviously so much news going on, but the big thing that's coming up is obviously the German elections this Sunday. What are the big issues? I mean, there were obviously, before the past week's events that we just mentioned happened, there was an awful lot of talk about these elections more generally. What are the big issues that Germans are focused on? And what are the parties offering in terms of that?
The general background of the upcoming election is that Germany is an ailing economy, has been in decline 2 years in a row in recession, will barely grow this year. And there's a kind of identity crisis about what is the once famous German industry worldwide. It's being challenged by China, not only on the Chinese market, but on the world markets, probably much more important and much more damaging. China is now the big exporting powers. Germany still is, but it's losing market shares to China. And so there's kind of a reflection about what should be the German economy and how to manage that. In light of this, the election campaign has been mostly about, I would say, style of management. And one of the reasons the current conservative leader, Friedrich Merz, is the arch favorite to become chancellor is that he offers the decisive image that the Germans may need in this context, even though the substance of the current problems have barely been mentioned in the campaign. We wrote a story a few weeks ago saying most of the German economic problems or issues haven't been tackled by the campaign. The second theme is immigration, partly carried by the AfD that they mentioned, the far-right party, that means given, which is polling at around 20% of the vote currently in Germany. To give some perspective, the Front National, the Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen's far-right party in France, polled 30%. So Germany is still, given the AfD, is a much more, much farther on the right than even Rassemblement National. So you can't barely compare. And so the Musk impact, at least, the US, you mentioned the Trump, Musk, whatever is happening in the US at the moment, impact has been much less in Germany than you would have expected. Musk wrote a big op-ed in Die Welt, which is a mainstream conservative newspaper. It created a row, it created debate about whether he should have been allowed to do that. He carried a Twitter interview with the AfD party. And of course, you had J.D. Vance, the vice president, in Munich, in Germany, last weekend, exhorting the government to basically deal with AfD, if not to bring it into power, which will not happen, because there's a kind of sanitary barrier has been erected by mainstream parties around the AfD. It will not happen, but the AfD could surprise. There's absolutely certain that Merz will come out a winner, but the AfD might surprise, and then it might reshuffle and then influence the economic policy that the future government will lead.
Right. And here, obviously, we're talking about Elon Musk, right? The CEO of Tesla, and now seemingly a central right-hand man to Donald Trump over in the US.
Yeah.
And it's interesting kind of looking at this international influence operation, because the US is, its relationship to Europe is changing in a few key ways, it seems, which Trump didn't even dare to kind of approach during his first term. And that seems to be pushed by this, I guess, coalition of interests that are hostile to US military involvement in Europe, but also hostile to really sort of like the ideological basis of mainstream European parties. George, we just had J.D. Vance, the vice president of the United States, attending the Munich Security Conference last week, and he had quite a stark message about the US's view on Europe, right? What has been the reaction in Europe, either from politicos, but also I'm kind of interested in just like the market reaction, right? Because it implies that maybe European defense companies are going to become more important, or, certain industrial sectors where the US had been a kind of key backstop are going to come to the fore.
Well, yeah, Vance's speech on the Friday at the Munich Security Conference went down like a proverbial cup of cold sick to, pretty much everyone in Europe. But the expectation that if you have a US vice president in that kind of setting, against the backdrop of the Ukraine war, is that he'll kind of basically do a speech largely focused on that. Instead, it was all about the kind of the enemy within, and what he describes as the enemy within, which in his view was like the lack of Europe's ability to embrace proper freedom of speech and democracy, which went down, quite badly, as you might imagine. But certainly the defence sector got the message from that, because the upshot to everyone in Europe was, going back to what Amy said earlier, was that we're on our own. Not only are we talking about kind of what kind of ways, we're not really talking about what kind of ways the US might help. It's just like the US is actively slagging Europe off and its kind of principles and way of life. So the upshot of that on Monday was a really sharp reaction with the likes of Rheinmetall, the German defence company, and some of the other ones up very sharply, well over 10%. Rheinmetall is actually pretty fascinating. It's kind of now worth $43 billion. It's actually kind of doubled since Trump got in November. And it's even more interestingly and eye-catchingly, it's kind of outperformed Nvidia over the last 4 years. It's really kind of had a stratospheric
That's really
rise,
remarkable.
and
Yeah.
it is rather, and there's a lot of kind of in order for it to justify that valuation, you kind of need to assume that Europe is going to start, like everyone in Europe is going to, each country in Europe is going to start spending 3% of GDP on defence, and that quite a big chunk of that, a bigger chunk than its current market share, goes to Rheinmetall. Not so sure about the what happens with the latter of those 2 points, but with the idea that Europe is going to spend more on defence, possibly up to 3%, that now looks pretty hardwired to happen because it has to happen.
I was kind of curious as well, Pierre, just on, the points that George is talking about there, that this sort of idea that Europe now has to sort of bolster its own defences and maybe use its own companies really to do that. But we've obviously seen, Emmanuel Macron has been weakened at home. We're going to see the result of this German election and who is in power there, which will obviously determine an awful lot about the way Europe goes, like the direction Europe goes. Do you think there are signs? I mean, there was obviously this meeting that Emmanuel Macron called of European leaders. Can they unite in a way that they really haven't before behind this sort of collective cause that now America is no longer as friendly as it was to them?
Yes, to complete what George was just saying, the main reason Europe has to increase its defense spending, and it doesn't have much choice, is because Putin. There's now the acknowledgement that Europe is at war, or that Putin has waged a war in Europe, and it might be even worse if a hastily concluded Ukraine deal comes out of the current US-Russian talk. It will make the Russian threat more obvious and more pressing at Europe's border. So there's no question that all the major European military powers, Germany, France, and the UK, have acknowledged that they need to boost defense spending significantly, if not double it. The fact that the US and Vance is part of the culture warriors that despise the EU, have designated the EU as the adversary, at least intellectually and politically, and so you know where this leads to. The question for European leaders is whether this kind of those rants or this kind of are going to last 4 years, or they're going to last 12 years. If Vance is, you never know. The worst can happen is re-elected president. So, if 4 years you can wait it out, 12 years you really have to brace for the possibility that the US might not become, but the threat will not come from the US, but the US is an adversary. Okay, so that also does not lead to lower defense spending or to lowering your guard, which is the uncertainty of the situation at present for Europe is that first, as you noticed, it's 27 countries plus the UK, which is part of that response. And so to say they're divided is like a media cliche. Every other day you can say, oh, Europe is divided, and they're divided, and they're even more uncertain is that for the moment, I should remind you that we don't have anything concrete coming from this new US administration, neither on tariffs nor on Russia. Even Rubio has thrown out yesterday about the possibility that they might strike a deal before Easter, which has been branded about it. So we have nothing to base some action on. Okay, Europe has nothing to count on. However, they do know that they have to brace for the worst, and so increased defense spending is a given. Whether they don't have the means to do it, fiscally they're tightened, they're constrained, and they're trying to find ways around this. But if you're talking about Germany, the new probable future chancellor is very much in favor of boosting defense spending significantly, as opposed to in what happened in previous 2 decades.
You mentioned that we have to prepare for the worst. I mean, maybe it's worth just thinking through what does the worst look like, or maybe what does the potential path forward from here look like. Obviously, a peace deal would involve various considerations around like what happens to territory that's occupied on both sides of the border, what happens to the US-Ukrainian economic relationship. I mean, do we have any kind of sense of what the bounds might be on those elements of a peace deal
Well,
and how European leadership could deal with that?
it's a very good question. I think one of the areas that Vance really, I mean, forget about these calls for embrace far right parties, etc. Is when he and Hegseth the day before, the defense secretary the day before, threw doubt on the US commitment to European defense, meaning that you now caught with the idea that what about Article 5, which means that any aggression against the NATO members should be tackled by the whole of the alliance and should trigger a response by the whole alliance. This is very fragile now. And if you're Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia, 3 Baltic countries that are members of NATO, on which Putin has, first of all, threatened, and on which, at least in the case of Latvia, he might have some territorial ambitions, do you trust NATO to be your line of defense or not? And throwing doubt on any type of strategic commitment, but on a military alliance like they did, is really dangerous, because the credibility, which is central to any form of defense strategy, even if it's not nuclear, the credibility of your armed forces and your defense is thrown into question. And I think Europe has to prepare for the fact that they're not preparing a future with less US involvement, but with no US involvement altogether. I think that would be the wise thing to.
If I could just ask a perhaps provocative question here, but I think it's the one that's on the mind of everybody looking at this from the US. In terms of the idea of credibility, thinking about this in regards to Germany specifically, the history of the embrace of the Nord Stream project, Germany's kind of role that seems to be somewhat on the back foot historically compared to France or Poland right now, when you're looking at either level of expenditure or kind of just rhetorically being out front, like Macron's recent meeting. Like, does Germany have credibility? Is there a way for Germany to develop credibility? Like, is there a leader that is saying anything that heads realistically in that direction right now in this campaign?
Yes, the first answer would be that to have credibility, you have to have a strong economy. The reason Macron has lost all influence on the world stage is because he's presiding over a very, very absolutely terrible economic situation and fiscal situation, and France doesn't have the means of its lofty, whatever, ambitions or whatever, visions or whatever you call it. So Germany's problem is first that. I mean, this is an aging country. Demographics play a key role in the decline of the economy. They still refuse to have immigrants, whereas they need 300,000 immigrants a year to keep the machine going, to keep their industries and their factories going. So they have to deal with that first. The will, I think at least on the part of America and even on the part of other parties, I think they've learned the lessons of the long Merkel era, where nothing happened, no reforms, nothing, and addiction to Russian cheap gas and the Chinese market was left to develop without any form of control or limits. And so I think they've learned those lessons. Whether they act on it depends on the results of the election, because the Conservatives won't be able to govern by themselves. They'll have to strike a deal with another party. The coalition means compromise, and then we'll see how the compromise ends up. But I think the lessons have been learned, is my impression.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true. I mean, if we can think about the significance of the current moment, compare it to 2022, basically there was a handbrake turn when Germany and the other big countries in Europe realised that they'd just been assuming that Russian gas would flow forever, and Russia wouldn't do something like invading Ukraine, and then they did, and like where we are now is possibly a similar inflection point where it's just been. There's always been an assumption that America will spend a lot on European defence, because they've been doing that for a long time, 70, 80 years. So, and we are transitioning out of that, right? And there's all sorts of questions about European unity that flow out of this. Because not all the European member states necessarily want to spend a lot on 2%, 3% on their defence of their GDP on their defence because they're not right up against Russia. But also equally, what's happening with the tariffs, Donald Trump's threat of reciprocal tariffs, that could also be bad for European unity as well, because the European Union needs to respond in a united way, and that may make it difficult to push back on what Trump is doing. So it's a bit of a gloomy picture from this side of the Atlantic, I'm afraid.
I was sort of wondering, though, George, I mean, it's obviously impossible for any of us to get inside the head of Donald Trump and what he was thinking with any of these things that he is talking about.
I wouldn't want to be there.
Yeah, I'm not up for that. Yeah.
Well, but the thing that I'm sort of curious about is if you were to look at the stocks that you mentioned yesterday, the European defence stocks that are all up, would that be the intended consequence that if you were, not threatening, but you were saying you're on your own now? I would have thought that what you would want as the US is that as a result of that, you build up your defences using American defence companies, not European. I just but
I mean that's an important point about what all this money. Pierre has been looking into this. There's a question of where you get all this money from and whether European member states are good for it. But then there's also a question of what they spend it on, and that is a kind of live issue which has again probably changed, richly in the last couple of days, because you would have thought, literally one of the ways that Europe could, play nice with Trump is to buy loads of defence and paraphernalia and arms off the US. That would be one way to play nice on trade. But if the US is not going to be as much of a friend as you used to think it was, is that actually a good idea? No, the answer to that is probably not, but you probably still do need to buy quite a lot of arms from the US, because where else are you going to buy them from? And even though Ryan Martel and the other defence stocks in Europe are rocketed up because people think they're going to sell a lot more stuff, and they are, we're probably going to still have to buy quite a lot off the US, particularly in the short to medium term. So that is another slight question mark.
Europe caught amid a push for self-sufficiency without the ability to get there in the near term. Certainly an extremely gloomy picture. Nonetheless, we will see this week how Germany responds to it. Pierre, George, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.
Thank you.